Okay, again, what you see in back of me is a Ford. This is Jeffrey's Ford. This is a different Ford. This is not on the west branch of the Brandywine. This is on the east branch of the Brandywine Creek. Now the Brandywine Creek has two, east and west. It joins about a quarter of a mile into one branch that empties out into the Delaware. This branch here was the last ford crossed by Cornwallis and Howe around 11 to 12 o'clock in the afternoon. They knew about these two fords because of that British spy. He had a map. He drew it up. He gave it to Howe in the early mornings, probably near Kennett Square. The reason why are still not understood to this day, why that map was ever produced. It gave them an easy route to outflank Washington's army because these fords were unprotected. The protected fords were down at Chad's Ford, about a half a mile to a quarter of a mile to my east. Now as you see, the creek is high today. The ford would have been over a little bit to my left, over here. There would have been a road that went into the creek and came over. The British would have came down this hill in back of me, behind this ford. Now there's an account of a Quaker lived right here where I'm standing. Jeffrey's Ford. Jeffrey himself owned this property. Emerald Jeffrey. He lived over here in this house. Now when the British came down the hill above the ford, there was a house. His farm was there. He was a merchant from Wilmington. His house was ransacked. He saved liquor. He thought he would have it in Philadelphia. He didn't. He kept his liquor here in Chester County. Unfortunately, the British found his liquor up at that house and took it all. They took all his liquor up there and they ended up carrying it all off. Now these fords were extremely important in Howe's flanking maneuver. He needed these fords to get his cannons, his ammunition wagons, everything else in his army had to cross the ford. They couldn't cross the embankment. They'd crash into it. They needed these fords to get their army to outflank Washington. Now what we see here is a bridge. It's a structure that was put over. This was most likely, or it was, a covered bridge. Now there's an account of a Townsend, a Quaker in the area. He was here at this spot when he saw the British. He was fond of new things, he said, and he heard about the reports of the British. Like I was saying before, the Quakers were plain people. They wore brown suits. They had round hats. They did not see anything different in this area. He was standing on this side of the Brandywine. He stood over here with his daughters, and his cousins that were living with him at the time, and they saw in the field behind me a bunch of redcoats. He said, and soon the field was completely covered with scarlet uniforms, and their bayonets shined silver in the sun. That was over in that field across Jeffrey's Ford. Now, the British would have crossed here. It would have taken them a while to cross here. The baggage train was in a line. It wasn't side by side. These roads were small, so they had to cross one at a time. It could have took them 2 hours before the whole army came across this ford. Now they came up across the ford here, and they came up to a road. They came up the Birmingham Road. They made a sharp right, and they ended up to the grist mill, where my first video was filmed. That's where they ended up, and that's where the flanking maneuver happened. Now this was a long march. They had to march from Kennett Square. They had to outflank on two positions. This ford and then the other ford. It took them a while to get to this position. It was long. It was warm that day. It was foggy. The fog lifted probably around the time they crossed this ford. By that time, they were spotted. When they crossed here, Washington knew that they most likely were getting outflanked. He had a couple of accounts stating that the British were in the fields above Jeffrey's Ford. Washington didn't believe it. He didn't believe it. He had accounts that they were crossing the Brandywine, and they weren't. So he didn't believe it. He stayed at Chad's Ford. He didn't believe his cavalry. His cavalry returned and says, we see them, they're coming. Now, a couple other things about the ford. This general area, it's very wooded. It's very attractive. It looks like it exactly like it would have been back then. A couple of the officers, Jeffrey Townsend, followed the army. The Quaker local followed the army. And one of the officers went up to him and says, boy, you surely have a lot of beautiful land in this area. They were impressed. But unfortunately, a lot of these guys, this was the last thing they were going to see because a lot of guys died. The guys that made this march didn't make it. They were killed on the battlefield. So this is Jeffrey's Ford, and Lord Cornwallis and Howe crossed this point on September 11th, 1777 at around 11 or 12 o'clock in the afternoon.